Welcome to this presentation covering Chapter 1. I'm going to show you the first 12 slides just really quickly so that you can write down any of the blanks that you might not have gotten for your study guide. If there is a particular slide that you need to spend some time on, just go ahead and pause the broadcast and then we'll pick up in a second. So I'm not going to linger too long on these slides. Here we go. We're on slide 13. This is where we ended our class on Monday. So let me refresh you on this material. CLE is a very common term for legal professionals to use. It stands for Continuing Legal Education. Attorneys in Texas are required to have 15 hours of continuing legal education every year, 3 of which have to relate to ethics issues. Paralegals, because they're not licensed, aren't required to have any CLE, but most paralegals choose to take some CLE from time to time. CLE opportunities really vary in the legal profession. Many attorneys go to continuing legal education seminars. Some are free, especially if they are sponsored by a law firm who is trying to generate business amongst other attorneys, perhaps attorneys who work for a corporation. Sometimes they are free because the organizing entity wants to encourage attorneys and paralegals to do some type of volunteer work. So for example, a Legal Aid of Northwest Texas might sponsor a free CLE about how to represent indigent people who are going through divorce. So there's some that are free, but there are some that are quite expensive. It can be several hundred to even thousands of dollars to attend certain CLEs. And then there's a lot in the middle that aren't super expensive, that aren't completely free. I encourage you, once you're in practice, to take advantage of continuing legal education opportunities. As I say, obviously the law firm, you would want for them to pay for your CLEs that cost money, but you can get CLE opportunities informally. For example, you can read legal periodicals and other materials to stay abreast of the law, and those would be free even though you're not actually attending a seminar. So I wanted to get you familiar with that term because, of course, attorneys talk about that all the time, and it is a really smart way to stay abreast of the law. For example, the Texas State Legislature has just gotten out of session, and there have been some legislative changes. And so many times attorneys and paralegals will attend presentations that talk about what the legislature has done and how changes have been made. Or perhaps there's a recent either U.S. or Texas Supreme Court case that has changed the law in a particular area. So sometimes it's about cutting-edge areas of law, but sometimes it's just staying familiar with what's going on in your particular discipline, or perhaps finding out about other disciplines that are related to your area of the law but you may not be as familiar with. So let's continue on. Let's talk about some skills that can be very useful to cultivate. Some of these are, I guess all of these are fairly logical, but I'd like to highlight them just for a moment. Most of the skills that you use in an office environment, in a white-collar environment, are going to be similar to the skills that you can use as a paralegal. Obviously, you're going to want to be professional. You're going to want to be dressed professionally. You're going to want to use professional etiquette, things along those lines. And obviously, you'll need to be efficient. Your client is typically going to be paying for your services based upon time. And so if you do a task in 90 minutes that should only take 60 minutes, your client isn't going to be too happy with you, and very likely your attorney isn't going to be too happy with you because the attorney is going to have to write off or subtract some of that time from the bill that is being submitted to the client. So efficiency is definitely a valued skill in a legal professional. Thinking logically, being methodical in how you approach issues, and developing, it's a term that you'll hear many legal professionals use, it's called thinking like an attorney. And not that all attorneys are logical by any means, but the idea of being methodical about how you approach issues is an important skill to develop. Many of you will come to this class having those logical skills, but it's a good idea to, when you're working as a legal professional, to notice how your attorney approaches issues. It is a skill, and it is also a vocabulary, and it is a way of viewing the world that is a little bit perhaps different from the way other folks might view the world. Not better, not worse, just a little bit different. And then, of course, analyzing. Many times you'll be presented, your client will present you with an issue that is very complex, has many moving pieces and many factors to consider. And breaking down those pieces and considering them each separately and then considering them in combination. Also having the ability to kind of to deal with ambiguity. When you are analyzing your client's situation, it won't be exactly like any other situation that you've confronted. And you won't be able to find a case that is exactly the same as your client's situation. And so living with that ambiguity, working out a solution, given the fact that there's some difference between this and other situations, is a good skill to develop. Here's some more general characteristics. We already talked about analytical skills, but communication skills are so important. And really, speaking skills, listening skills, and writing skills, key. This is probably the one, though, that is the one that you're most likely to need to develop separate from just your ordinary professional skills, because writing is a big component of many, probably most paralegals' jobs. I was talking with a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, and she was saying how, she's a paralegal, she was saying how most of her final product, or the way she presents the work that she does, is almost always in writing. And so that's, even though not all the tasks that she does are writing, the way she shows her client and her colleagues what she's been doing is by being effective at writing. And so that's just such an important skill. But certainly listening and speaking are also really important skills. You're going to be obviously dealing with other legal professionals and clients and courts as a paralegal, and developing a tact, straightforwardness, but also considering your client's interest and speaking in a nuanced way. And speaking before, or thinking before speaking is a skill that can be very important to develop. Many of you all obviously come to the table with those skills, but those are things to consider. We have, for those of y'all that are in the AAS program, there is a speech component to our program that can help with those skill sets. If that's something, if you're hesitant to speak, or perhaps would like to develop more sophistication of skills, those can be very good opportunities. And then we'll talk a little bit about active listening in this course, not a lot, but a little bit, and the importance of listening and getting feedback, or making sure that you're understanding what is being said. Many times when you deal with clients and witnesses, they are approaching a situation with a certain level of emotional investment, as well as a particular agenda. And I don't mean that in a bad way, that they're lying to you necessarily, although you certainly will encounter clients and witnesses who do lie, but they view the world in a particular way. And the way they view the world may be their sincerely held belief, but it may not reflect reality. And so listening to tease out the facts that you can confirm, and realizing there's some ambiguity perhaps in other situations, and making sure that you're communicating effectively and that you are hearing what is being said. Those can save a lot of challenges later on, and they can really help to build a good relationship, a good rapport with your client. Computer skills. This is especially important if you work for a smaller law firm, where when the system crashes, you can be the person who saves the day. There are many attorneys who have very sophisticated computer skills, but there are also many who don't. And so they sometimes look for sophisticated or computer-savvy paralegals to fill in that gap in their knowledge level, and to make sure systems are working appropriately, and somebody who can deal with not only solving the system, but also dealing with technicians who have to be called in from time to time to communicate what the problem is and to learn how to solve problems going forward. Certainly we're talking about, having Word skills and Excel skills, but also being able to e-file and to maintain and establish websites and things like that. So it's more than just using computer software, but also that's certainly included in that. But doing things beyond that can also be a very good way to market yourself. Again, for small firms. Large firms are going to have dedicated computer professionals who can do much of that work, although it's still useful to have paralegals and other legal professionals who are able to help, especially if something comes up over the weekend or at night. Organizational skills. Of all the skills I said, this is probably the single most important. Many attorneys find organization a challenge. And even if they're reasonably good at it, they often find that they have so many different fires going on at any particular time. It's just beyond the ability of their time to organize and to manage that. And so many times they look to their paralegal as the person to keep the calendar, remind about coming due dates. They want their paralegal to be the person who can find that document super quick in that crisis situation. If you can be that person, you will always be employed as paralegal. Even if you don't have the strongest writing skills or the strongest computer skills, if you have those organizational skills, you are going to be an extremely valuable member of the team. And so I encourage you when you're drafting your resume to highlight those skills so that the attorney can see that, yes, this is somebody I can trust and who will be there for me and will remind me of the deadlines that I forget about. Interpersonal skills, obviously they're essential in any work situation. They can be especially important for the paralegal because, as I said before, the paralegal is often that contact with the client. The client oftentimes is in a very difficult situation emotionally, sometimes financially, and in other respects. And that client may be struggling with those issues that he or she is dealing with. And if you can be the person who can help the client, but also maintain a certain level of social distance, a certain boundary between too much involvement in the client's personal circumstances, that is a very good and professional position to be in, and it's hard to manage, certainly. It is also can be useful in dealing with opposing counsel. Opposing counsel has a different agenda than obviously you have because he wants his or she wants his or her client to win and you want your client to win. But managing through those and realizing where the common interests can exist and where professionalism can help both sides accomplish what they want to is a very useful interpersonal skill to have. Many attorneys are charming, warm, delightful people. But there are also attorneys who, either because of workplace stress or just not having the nicest personality, can be difficult. I think it's rare that you'll find a legal professional who hasn't dealt with another legal professional who is a bit of a jerk. Being able to manage those relationships, keeping your cool when the attorney perhaps isn't keeping his or her cool, and not taking it excessively personally, but being able to step back and say, you know what, that person is yelling at me, but what he's really doing is venting, or he's transferring some anxiety that he has to me when it's really not about me. I'm not excusing those behaviors. They're inappropriate, and I certainly understand legal professionals who want to disengage from those employment situations. But also being able to develop some space and say, you know what, this person is delightful 80% of the time, and it's a good job, and I'm going to put up with some of the less pleasant aspects. That can be also a reasonable position to take. Then, of course, being able to keep confidences. This is huge, obviously. If you can't keep confidences, you are not going to be successful as a legal professional. You will learn things through your career that are sometimes shocking, sometimes disturbing, sometimes unpleasant. And you just kind of have to move on and remember that even if your client isn't the nicest person or isn't the most generous or most ethical person, he or she has come to you for assistance, and it's not your role to judge that person. I mean, your privacy of your own mind, you can make whatever judgments you want, but being able to maintain those confidences and to continue to provide excellent legal services to somebody, even if they perhaps aren't the most deserving. and professionalism, being that professional even in difficult situations. I'll move on, won't talk about the discussion topics here. About 75% of paralegals work in law firms. That's also true for attorneys, but 75% work in law firms. Most paralegals and attorneys will spend their entire legal careers working in law firms. And that's a very good path, but there are certainly other paths to consider. While almost all attorneys and paralegals will start in a law firm, there are paths after that if you want to pursue them. For example, working in a corporation, or working for a government agency, or doing legal aid type work. Pro bono work is what it's called, though I guess if you work in legal aid, you are usually being paid some amount of money, even if it's less than you were earning in the for-profit community. Although the vast majority of paralegals work in law firms, the culture in law firms can vary significantly. So it would not at all be true that all law firms are the same. I talked about this in lectures, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but generally law firms, smaller law firms, the smaller it is, the less formal it is, the less likely it's going to be necessary for you to have a very conservative professional wardrobe. You're going to have that on some occasions in any type of office if you were, for example, going to court. But there are small law firms where people wear cut-off jeans and flip-flops on many days. There's going to be more varied tasks. You're going to have more opportunities oftentimes to have that direct client contact. You may be working on a divorce one day, a will another day, a DWI the next day. That can be very appealing, but it can also be kind of intimidating because you don't become a tremendous expert in any given area, and so it can feel like, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing today. That can be exhilarating. It can also be stressful. So that's a special kind of stress that you shouldn't have in law firms. You'll also find in a small law firm, usually the compensation is lower and there's going to be fewer benefits. So that's a trade-off. Most paralegals are going to start in the smaller firms and then, if they wish to, move to the larger law firms. A large law firm is going to be more formal. There's going to be less flexibility about what you wear. There's also going to be more formality and a sense of hierarchy. It's going to be more clear, and there's going to be more levels and more procedures that you have to follow to get certain tasks done. And that's true, I think, probably for corporate America as well. Small companies have less formalities than large companies. You'll likely be more specialized, which can be good in that you're going to likely feel more confident that you know what you're doing, but it can also be a little bit mundane and repetitive. And if you get yourself pigeonholed narrowly enough, you may find it hard to move to another opportunity because you specialize in such a very specific field, your skills may not transfer as readily. And of course, the compensation is likely to be higher and the benefits are likely to be better. There's also likely to be more prestige with most large law firms. Here's a chart. This is from a while ago, so the numbers you'll find are likely to be higher as you go into your career. So you'll find if it's a one attorney law firm, the pay is going to be the lowest, and you see it goes up every time you get a little bit. Well, I guess this is an exception. The pay doesn't go up between 6 and 10 and 11 and 25, but that's more of a blip than anything else. At the very biggest law firms, you're going to find the pay is significantly higher. This is largely due to the fact that paralegals in these law firms are going to get overtime pay. There are plenty of paralegals who earn six-figure incomes in these very large law firms, but they're working a lot of hours. In the smaller law firms, it's less likely that you'll have overtime. You may actually be a salaried employee. We'll talk more about the differences between salaried and hourly in a subsequent lecture. As I say, these numbers are a little bit old, so you might want to add maybe $5,000 to these figures to reflect where the market is today. It gives you a sense of as to how to approach these numbers. Here is a link that will give you somewhat a feel of where the current pay rates are for some of these industries. Corporations are probably the most difficult type of career path for a paralegal to get a job in. The reason for that is that most corporations, even relatively big corporations, don't have huge legal departments, and therefore they don't have the staff to engage in a lot of training. They really want the paralegal and the attorney, for that matter, to be able to hit the ground running on the first day and to be productive in that environment. But there are some truly large corporations. For example, I worked at JCPenney when I was there. At times they had over 150,000 employees, and the legal department was about roughly 100 employees, maybe 90 employees. About 45 were attorneys, maybe about 15 were paralegals, and then the rest were support staff, legal secretaries, office managers, librarians, file room professionals, computer professionals, things along those lines. In the larger corporations, there can sometimes be more of an opportunity to train into the job. And so you'll find in some corporations that there are paralegals who never worked for a large law firm. The path that they pursued was to be a legal secretary and then to wow their bosses into becoming a paralegal. That path was much more common in the 80s and 90s than it is today. I wouldn't recommend pursuing that path unless you're also pursuing the credentials at the same time, because I don't think there's as many opportunities along those lines today. So you're probably not going to start out at a corporation unless you're already well established at a corporation and then can make the transfer from whatever your job responsibilities are now to that new job responsibility. But corporation jobs are highly sought after. That's one of the reasons they can be choosy. Usually the hours are much more regular than a corporation. There's usually a lot of stress. The most stressful work usually gets sent out to law firms, and so it's the law firm paralegals that are being stressed and not the in-house paralegals. And the pay can be higher. Certainly the benefits can be higher. The pay isn't always higher, but there's usually more job security and benefits along those lines. Things like pensions and vacation pay and things like that are usually greater. Government work is another option. Of course, you can work for the federal government or for the state government or the local government. You have many of the advantages of the corporation. For example, there's likely to be more regular hours, less stress, but usually the pay is significantly less, although the benefits may be higher. And there oftentimes is higher job security. Legal aid offices, they do work for those of us that are the least privileged, the folks who have the least assets. They do really, really important work, and it is very, very good for the soul. You'll find many legal professionals who work for corporations and law firms as their day job will volunteer for legal aid offices. The legal aid offices do employ some attorneys and paralegals for pay. Usually, though, the income is significantly lower. It can be a job of great satisfaction and very great responsibility. So it kind of depends on how you balance those things out. There is a possibility of being a freelance paralegal once you are well established in your career. A freelance paralegal is his or her own boss. He or she has his or her own business, and he or she works for attorneys on a contract basis. This works best when the paralegal is well established in the legal community and knows the other attorneys in that legal community, or knows attorneys in the legal community. And so he or she can come into an office and provide support. For example, when when an attorney's paralegal resigns or maybe has a medical issue and can't work as many hours or has a baby or something like that, and then that freelance paralegal can come in and help and support. Attorneys also will hire freelance paralegals when the law firm has suddenly a significantly greater amount of work. And sometimes when you're a freelance paralegal, you can work from home or you can have reduced hours, maybe to work out some work-life balance issues. The downside, of course, is that there's a fluctuating income. There isn't necessarily a lot of continuity in your employment. And, of course, because you're self-employed, you're probably going to find that, benefits and things like that are not going to be part of the equation. Salaries. Let's talk a little bit, and I said I would talk about this later, but let's talk about this now a little bit about the difference between being salaried and being hourly. A salaried person is a person who earns the same pay rate week in and week out, irrespective of the number of hours that he or she works. So let's say my pay rate is, we'll give it an annual number. My pay rate is $50,000 a year. And let's say I have 2 weeks of vacation, and so I work 50 weeks a year, and so therefore, on weeks that I work, I'm earning $1,000. If you were to divide that up into 40 hours, that would be 280, and that would be 25. That would work out to be $25 an hour. But you'll find when you have a salaried position, if in a particular week you take off your afternoon and you don't make up the time, so you only work 35 hours, you'll still earn that $1,000 a week. Of course, that's a gross amount, there'll be taxes withheld. And you'll find also, if you're salaried, if you actually work beyond 40 hours, maybe you work on Saturday or you work late into the night one day, maybe you work 50 or even 60 hours, your pay rate is still going to be the $1,000 a week. It doesn't vary based upon the number of hours that you work. And that's the way attorneys are paid. That is the way that some paralegals are paid, on a salaried basis. Hourly basis, though, is probably more common, especially in the larger law firms. So instead, in this scenario of earning a set $50,000 a year in a large law firm, the paralegal might earn the same $25 an hour. But if she or he takes Wednesday afternoon off and doesn't work any overtime, then the paralegal would not see a gross amount of $1,000 that week. It would be somewhat less, reflecting the fact that she or he only worked 36 hours that week. On the other hand, if she works overtime, she's going to get time and a half for each hour over 40 that she works. So time and a half would be 25 plus $12.50. So each hour that she works above 40, she or he would earn $37.5. And of course, you do the math. Let's say he worked 50 hours that week, so 40 would be at the $25 an hour, and 10 would be at the $37.50 an hour. And so he or she would work significantly more than $1,000, earn significantly more than $1,000 for that particular week. So you may be thinking, well, which one should I go for? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that the status of the job, whether it's salaried or hourly, will be established before you apply for the job. It's very unlikely that the employer would change the pay system based upon your preferences. So as you're looking for jobs, you may think, well, which job should I look for? My advice to you would be really to ignore whether it's a salaried job or an hourly job, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really make a lot of difference. I mean, there's some advantages to having a salaried job. It's a steady pay. There's some advantages to having an hourly job in that many paralegals work overtime. It's really nice to be rewarded for that extra work, and not just a pat on the back, but an actual financial incentive to do that kind of work. So there's arguments both ways. I'm going to tell you, though, a little bit about how this can impact the interviewing process. And that this is something that you would not necessarily know about. The textbook doesn't mention anything about it, but it can be a really important factor. And this applies really in the area of corporations. Corporations are, to some extent, especially large corporations, are bureaucracies. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just the nature of the creature. There's many good aspects to them being bureaucracies, but there's also some negative aspects. And one of the negative aspects can relate to HR policies. Corporations, believe it or not, don't exist to have law departments. Law departments are an expense department. They are a necessary evil, so to speak, in a corporation. Imagine that you are applying to work for Ford Motor Company. Well, Ford Motor Company doesn't hire paralegals because they're in the business of doing legal work. They hire paralegals to perform legal functions to support their business of making cars. So their profit centers are going to be their factories and to support people who help those factories work. You aren't going to ever screw in a nut in to make a car work, obviously, because you're a paralegal. You're necessary to the entity for sure, but you are not a profit center for it. So when Ford Motor Company designed its HR policies, it's focused not on the legal department. It's focused on the other branches. For one, another reason why it doesn't focus on the legal department is that although I'm sure Ford Motor Company has a very large legal department, compared to its overall population of employees, it's very small. And it's not, frankly, as important as the factories and the other things that are going to generate an income. So the HR department doesn't sit back and say, you know what, we want to make sure we have HR policies that are the absolute best for the legal department. I don't mean to say that the HR department wants to mess up the legal department or do something evil to the legal department. It's just not the first concern, nor should it be, honestly. So when it drafts policies, it's thinking about the vast majority of its workforce. Well, here's a little bit of information about how, and maybe Ford isn't the best example. Let me use the example of a restaurant. Let's say we're talking about Brinkers, who owns Chili's. It looks at its workforce and says the vast majority of its hourly employees are people who cook in the kitchens, wait tables, clean the tables, do functions along those lines. They have a it's not an easy, those aren't by any means easy jobs, but they're very well defined. There's not a lot of discretion. You make the hamburger the same way again and again and again, and you don't suddenly decide, you know what, I'm going to completely change the recipe and do it completely differently. No, you're supposed to cook the hamburger the way that you were trained to cook the hamburger. And you do the best you can, you do the best job you can. Hopefully your burgers are a little bit more juicy than the next guy's, but you're following the same instructions. That's the way most hourly jobs are. They present many opportunities to excel and to work faster and better, but the actual output is pretty predictable. And that's the way it would be at Brinkers. So that's how an hourly job functions in that environment. Most salaried positions at Brinker or Ford or some other business are going to be managerial. The folks who are salaried are going to be directing work, making lots of discretionary decisions. Sometimes good decisions, sometimes bad decisions, but they're going to be making decisions. They have much less of a playbook to work from. The nature of that means that sometimes they decide, you know what, I'm going to have to work a lot more hours because Sally, the cook, isn't here, and so I'm going to have to flip some burgers because I need to make sure that the work gets done however it needs to get done. So in a salaried environment, there's the recognition that you kind of have to go above and beyond sometimes. And you, again, these are good managers. There's lots of managers who aren't good, who don't do this. But the idea is you pitch it, you do what's necessary into the circumstances. And you have the responsibility to make those decisions on your own, on the fly, without necessarily approving everything with a boss. So the hourly worker has to go to his boss and says, hey boss, I think I need to stay late to do X, Y, and Z. And then that hourly worker gets either approval or doesn't get approval and follows the guidance from the manager. But the manager is more proactive, has the authority to make those decisions for himself or herself. So that's the way it works in the vast majority of hourly versus salary jobs. Another feature that distinguishes hourly and salary jobs is that in most industries, folks who work on an hourly basis are paid less than folks who work on a salaried basis. That's not inevitable. It's not true in every industry by any means, but it is true pretty commonly. Another difference is that folks who work on an hourly basis usually receive less benefits, or sometimes can receive less benefits than salaried folks. Now, sometimes people interpret this to mean that hourly workers are less important than salaried workers. That's, in my opinion, a very misguided view. Many of the most important workers out there are hourly paid. The person, for example, who maintains and repairs the aircraft is almost certainly hourly paid. But he has one of the most important jobs, or she has one of the most important jobs there is, because if he or she misses something, the plane crashes. That responsibility is so much more huge than what maybe a shift manager at a Chili's has for his or her responsibilities. So the skill level of a job doesn't depend upon whether it's salaried or hourly. The importance of the job doesn't depend upon it. But again, the nature of the tasks, are they very well defined and very consistently performed? More likely to be hourly versus salary. So anyway, that's a little bit of information about wage hour law. And you may have wondered why I gave you all that information. Let me tell you how this all fits together. The Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Administration, is the federal branch of the government that decides, or at least gives advice to employers about whether a particular job ought to be salaried or hourly. And they also enforce the laws about that. Well, the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Administration has issued opinions pretty consistently that paralegals ought to be paid on an hourly basis. There's a few reasons why they say that. One reason they say that is that there are plenty of very excellent paralegals who do not have a 4-year degree. And so they are not, and even those that do have a 4-year degree, it's not absolutely essential they have it. You know, an attorney has to graduate from college to go to law school, and he has to graduate from law school to sit for the bar. There's no such thing nowadays in every state, I think, except for California, of attorneys who don't have those credentials. You just have to. There's no way around it. You can't sit for the bar until you do those things. But you don't have to sit for the bar as a paralegal. And so while many paralegals have 4-year degrees, they don't absolutely have to have it. So that's one reason the Department of Labor says it's more of an hourly job than a salary job. Another thing, this is probably the bigger reason why the Department of Labor says that it is that paralegal is an hourly position versus a salary position, is that paralegals work under the guidance of an attorney. They don't have any discretion to make independent decisions. That is technically true, but while it's technically true, it's for the most part not kind of big capital T true, because a paralegal who has an excellent relationship with his or her attorney is making decisions all the time, and the attorney is oftentimes saying, I trust your judgment, I trust you, if that's what you think we ought to do, then that's what we're going to do. But technically the attorney could say, nope, we're not doing that. And so the discretion doesn't always exist, or at least it has a final outside force that has to approve that discretion. So for those reasons, the Department of Labor Wage and Administration said paralegals ought to be paid on an hourly basis. And that's why big law firms do pay paralegals on an hourly basis for the most part. So you may be wondering to yourself, why do some law firms pay paralegals on a salary basis? Well, there's several reasons. There are some bad employers out there. There are some bad employers who want to deny their workers the benefits of overtime pay. And so they pay their paralegals or other workers who should be exempt, or who should be paid on an hourly basis, they pay them on a salary basis so that they can deny those workers the income that they have rightly earned. I don't know how many their employers fit into that category. That is probably some group of the employers who pay paralegals on a salary basis, but I don't think that's most employers who pay their paralegals on a salary basis. I don't think they're mainly doing it to achieve the paralegals. I think there's two other reasons why corporations and smaller law firms sometimes pay paralegals on a salaried basis instead of an hourly basis. One has to do with cash flow. If I'm a small law firm and I only have a few workers, if I have a big case, a big trial come up, and I'm having paralegals and other folks work lots and lots of overtime hours, I may find it difficult to make the bills that particular month. Even though I can pay over the long haul my workers, I may find it hard to pay in the short term because of cash flow issues. And being salaried does help with cash flow issues, so that can be a factor. Another factor, and again this applies usually to corporations, is going back to those HR policies I talked about before. In most corporations, hourly workers have a relatively low maximum wage that can be paid. So if I am the general counsel of a corporation and I go to my HR department and say, I need to hire some paralegals, and the HR department says, okay, well, we want to pay them on an hourly basis, the most you can pay an hourly employee in our company is $20 an hour. Well, the general counsel says, I can't hire the quality and experience level of paralegals I need by paying just $20 an hour. It's not going to work. So that can be a problem. Another problem that can come up is that the benefits may be different for hourly workers versus salaried workers. And the general counsel may again say, I can't attract the quality and experience level of paralegals I want with these less than impressive benefits. Those can be reasons why some corporations pay their paralegals on a salary basis. But there can be other reasons, and these are more cultural than actually pay-driven. In many corporations, there is a belief, I think it's mistaken, but the belief exists anyway, that somehow people who are paid on a salaried basis are kind of more important, or more worthy of being listened to. So if I were, say, a paralegal in one of these corporations, and maybe because I'm a paralegal I have a smaller office because I'm hourly paid and the hourly office size is smaller than the salaried office size in this corporation, then when I'm meeting with a client, maybe a vice president of another division, and he comes to my office and he sees I have this little office, he may think of me, oh, well, a paralegal is really just a legal secretary. I will listen to what she has to say, but she really doesn't have the judgment or the knowledge level that I really have to pay attention to what she says. And so the paralegal in that environment is treated with less courtesy and deference and is treated less seriously, frankly, than a paralegal who was paid on a salaried basis. Another issue can be that many times paralegals in corporations move on to work on the business side. For example, when I was at JCPenney, I had a paralegal, a very excellent paralegal, who moved from being an HR paralegal to being an HR manager in the HR department. That type of move would be very difficult in many corporations if the paralegal were paid on an hourly basis to move to a salaried position. That transition can be, again, this turns on the culture of the corporations, by no means universal, but that can be a reason why it can be tricky. And so for those reasons, some corporations pay their paralegals on a salaried basis, not to cheat them out of money, in some respects to give them more money and more status within the organization. But those corporations know that there's these Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Administration rules out there. And so they know that there's a risk with paying paralegals on a salary basis. Because if that salaried paralegal works more than 40 hours in a week and wouldn't get overtime because they're salaried, then that paralegal has an argument, and the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Administration may buy the argument that that paralegal is entitled to overtime. And there's significant penalties associated with that. So many of these corporations will have a policy that salaried paralegals cannot work more than 40 hours. That's, again, to protect the corporation and the paralegal. But even in corporations like that, there's always going to be that emergency. There's always going to be that situation that does require extra work. And so a corporation is aware that this creates some legal vulnerability. So when you go into a job interview and you are exploring the pay issues, don't focus on whether it's salaried or hourly. Because if you start saying things like, why is it salaried, or does this mean I'm not going to get overtime, or things like that, the corporation may start thinking, oh, this is somebody who may be a squeaky wheel, who may file complaints with the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Administration and get us into a lot of trouble. It may be just innocent questions, but it may be designed to cause us lots of problems. And so if you start asking those questions and the position is salaried, it could well be that you're going to be removed from contention simply because the corporation is worried that you're going to be that squeaky wheel, that person who, if he or she doesn't get exactly what he or she wants, will report the employer to the Wage and Hour Administration. So don't ask those questions. Obviously, when you're at the point of accepting the job, it is very reasonable to say, now, will my pay be steady, or will it vary based upon the hours that I work? That's fine. But I wouldn't raise that during the early discussions. Asking questions about what will my overall pay be, or questions like that, would be perfectly fine. And you'll oftentimes find when you ask those questions, you'll get the answer, because the employer may say, well, it'll vary depending upon the hours you work that week, or it'll be a set amount because we're a salaried shop, or something like that. So you can get the information without diving too deeply. The bottom line is what your focus ought to be on at the end of the day is your overall compensation package. What are you going to earn at the end of the year, and what are your benefits like? Whether you're paid on a salaried basis or an hourly basis probably shouldn't be a driving factor. And even if it is really important to you one way or the other, it's not something you should raise during the early discussions. Okay, let's go to the next topic, which is the size of the office, the years of experience that you have, and your geographic location. pay does vary based upon the part of the country that you're in. If you decide to work in a Manhattan law firm as a paralegal, obviously you're going to earn more because the cost of living will be higher. I think we're in a pretty good sweet spot here in the Dallas-Fort Worth market. We have very nice income for paralegals, but the cost of living is still reasonable. But you certainly can find higher pay rates in other communities. You're going to find usually those pay rates are going to be higher, or the cost of living is going to be higher. If you want to work in downtown Dallas, you'll certainly find higher pay rates than you probably will in Collin County. And if you're willing to face that commute, then that can be a good choice for you. If you have experience with technology, you can oftentimes receive higher pay. If you're willing to work in certain areas that have higher pay, for example, intellectual property paralegals usually earn more than paralegals in other disciplines. Those can be ways to increase your pay. Benefits are going to vary. If you work for a corporation, you're probably going to find that you get the same type of benefits other people in the corporation earn. Law firms are not known for giving especially good benefits. They oftentimes spend more of their money on pay versus benefits. So when you're considering two offers, it's usually a good idea to look at the benefits as well. Let's move on. Here are some examples of how the pay rate goes up, and as I say, some of these numbers are a little bit dated. You're probably going to find that they're going to be somewhat higher. And you can see the pay rate. I'm not sure where they put us, if we're considered south or west here, because the west is the highest number and the south is the lowest number. My guess is the West is probably more including California. I wouldn't say that we're one of the highest areas. I would say that we're probably lower than the Northeast, for example. But because we're an urban area, we're probably not as low as this number would be. Long-term planning. It's a good idea, whatever your career plans are, to think in long-term plans. When you join our LinkedIn group, you will see that I post jobs from time to time that have significantly more experience requirements than you have right now. I do that for a couple of reasons. One is that alumni also participate in the board, and so they may well be ready for those positions with greater experience. I also do it for aspirational purposes. So you can look at a job and say, that's where I'd like to be in 5 years, and you can see, what do I need to get there? What are the skills that are being considered? And certainly in that equation, you're going to look at your personal preferences. Yes, intellectual property paralegals are going to earn more than family law paralegals. That's just a given. But if you hate technology and science, and that's just not your thing, you probably don't want to become an intellectual property paralegal. So think about what your values are, what your skills and talents might be. And of course, you're going to want to consider that these might change over time. You might hate science today, but once you get into a job where you start learning about patents and things like that, you may well decide, well, you know what, science isn't my thing generally, but I kind of like this. Then it's good to have short-term goals. For example, if you're looking for your first paralegal position, your goal is pretty much just to get hired by a law firm. Work there for a period of time, grow the job if you can, and then if you can't, move on in a year or two to a job where you'll have greater opportunities for personal growth and also for financial rewards. So those are some things to consider. And certainly the market can change. Right now the market's pretty good. There have been times while I've been in the paralegal program where the market has been softer. I'm sure we'll see ups and downs over time, and so it's always good to consider the realities of where the legal industry is. Networking. This is such a big issue. It's true probably for any industry, but it is definitely true for the legal business. Most career opportunities are not published, and so you have to know people to know about those opportunities. And it's such a good idea to maintain personal contacts. DAPA, which stands for Dallas Area Paralegal Association, is a wonderful networking organization in this area. Their website is dallasparalegals.org. They have a wonderful mentoring program and lots of other resources to get you into the legal community, and I encourage you to consider that. They have a reduced membership for paralegal students. I think it's $25 a year. If you are willing and able to devote the time to the organization to reap those benefits, it can be a good investment. I wouldn't join it just so it can go on your resume. I don't think you'll get a lot of benefit from that. It's the relationships you develop, going to the meetings, networking, that's really beneficial. Then there are internships. We have some through Collin College. We'll talk more about this later on, but we have a course called LGLA 1380, and that provides you the opportunity to get college credit for internships. Professor Wagoner runs that program usually, but I've also run it in the past, and I'd be happy to talk about it in more detail. And then using online networking sites. Right now, the one that is most commonly used by far is LinkedIn. I encourage you to develop a profile there, to spend, honestly, a significant amount of time tweaking it, making it look good, and then going out and networking. And you may think to yourself, you don't know people in legal business, and that may be true right now. But people you know people in legal business. And part of the secret to this is not just relying upon the people you know, but relying upon that extended network. So think about people that you know from this program, from your current position, from positions you've had in the past, people that you know from other educational situations you've had, people that you may know from your church or synagogue or temple, and people that you know from your neighborhood. So there can be lots of different ways to connect with people, to link in with people. You are welcome to link in with me if you would like. Just send me a request when you are ready, and I'll be happy to link with you. Then, of course, while these are great tools, I will be honest with you, probably your first job is not going to be through these personal contacts unless you have a lot of them. It's more likely going to be that you're going to find the job through postings. It may be the LinkedIn postings that I post. It could be through monster.com or Career Builder or tools like that. Also, this struck me as very odd, but I have discovered time and time again that there are lots of good postings for legal positions on Craigslist. Now, are the biggest law firms in town going to post on Craigslist? No, it's going to be the smaller law firms. But they're the ones that are willing to look at new and current students in paralegal programs. I always like to remind folks that Craigslist can be a great resource, but you have to be careful. You have to be safe. And so be sure that you're using good judgment. You don't want to meet, obviously, in places that aren't appropriate, that you're not comfortable with. For example, there are attorneys who work from their home, and so they may suggest that you meet in their home to interview. But I wouldn't meet there first. I'd probably want to meet at a Starbucks or some other place. Be sure to get their name and make sure that you can maybe make sure that there's not a problem with that person before you go into someone's home that you don't know. You can, of course, since they're attorneys, you can check them out at texasbar.com. If they are a felon, of a serious, particularly a violent felon, they aren't going to be able to be a member of the Texas Bar. That doesn't mean they're a good guy. That doesn't mean they're a nice person or they're a good woman. They can be a bad person and they can do bad things, but they haven't been caught doing them yet. Let me put it that way. And so you can always check the attorney here to make sure, number one, they are really an attorney, and number two, that they don't have some kind of disciplinary history. We'll talk about this in class at a later point in time. I'll show you how to use this tool more effectively. Okay, this is a new slide that I added that you won't find in your study guide. That's why everything is underlined. This is a little bit of information about LinkedIn. I encourage you to use it. I encourage you also to join our group. It is a closed group, so when you search for groups and find it, you'll have to ask to join. Once you ask, I will periodically, most days I do it, but I can't say I do it every day, I will check to see who wants to join, and then it's an automatic putting you into the group. If for some reason you request membership and it's been 2 or 3 days and I haven't waved you in, go ahead and send me an email, and that will remind me to check that out. A couple of things I want to point out about LinkedIn. It's a wonderful resource, and I highly encourage you to use it. But I will tell you that when you apply for jobs, many employers will check, even if you don't list your LinkedIn information on your resume, which I encourage you to do, but even if you don't, the employer will very oftentimes check your LinkedIn account. And so if there's inconsistencies, maybe just innocent inconsistencies, but inconsistencies nevertheless, the employer may decide, oops, this doesn't look good, or it may be fine, everything may be explainable, but I don't want to deal with that. So be sure that your resume and your LinkedIn information match up. You can add stuff on your resume that's not on your LinkedIn information, but I wouldn't omit jobs that you list on your LinkedIn site, and I'd make sure that my months and years of employment match up and that my job responsibilities are consistent. So be aware of that. Another thing is that if you're currently employed and you start adding things to your LinkedIn account, some employers may notice. So if you're suddenly saying things like looking for an opportunity as a paralegal when you currently are working as an accountant for a company, that place where you're looking might not be too thrilled with the idea that you might be leaving them soon. So be aware that there's always a possibility that somebody in HR or your boss may check you out on LinkedIn and see something that might cause you some issues. So those are some things to keep in mind with LinkedIn, but usually LinkedIn is a really cool resource to use. Okay, how do you find potential employers? Well, of course, when you're going to be using LinkedIn, you're going to be using Career Builder and Monster and Craigslist and other tools. But there are some specific ones to the legal business. One is martindale.com. These used to be every law firm of any size would have these journals or these encyclopedias of all the law firms in the United States and abroad, and they were huge. I mean, they were very thick volumes, 10 or more of them, so they were huge space in the law library. Nowadays, though, everything is online. It's all free to find, and you can find out information about law firms. It's probably more useful once you get the interview to then use martindale.com to find out information about the law firm. It's probably not as useful to finding law firms, but it still can be used in that sense. You can find out information about law firm. Now, some things that happen is that not all law firms choose to have a listing in Martindale. If it's a small law firm, it probably won't. It doesn't mean that the law firm isn't good. It just means that they decided not to invest in an ad on martindale.com. So just because they don't have an entry doesn't mean anything. Now, if a law firm doesn't have, if their attorneys aren't in TexasBar.com, that's a greater concern because you have to be licensed to practice in Texas. So you want to check here as well. Now, I will tell you that it is a requirement if you practice law in Texas to be a member of the Texas Bar. There are a few exceptions. Some situations where a person doesn't have to be a member of the bar and can still practice. So it's not 100%, but it's a very, very rare circumstance unless the person is employed by a corporation. You can use job placement services. I periodically will list something on LinkedIn that gives some information about that. Unfortunately, most job placement services are not interested in helping folks who are just starting in their career. They're more interested in helping folks who have a well-established paralegal career. They want to help the people who don't need the help, in other words. But you will find sometimes that job placement services will be willing to help new paralegals. It is important to think closely, though, before you pay any amount of money for services. I would discourage you from pursuing those options. Certainly not paying beforehand. If there is some kind of fee to actually get a job and you get the job, that might be something that you consider, but usually you're going to not, the employer will usually be the one paying those types of fees. So don't be disappointed if job placement firms aren't that interested in assisting you now, but keep that in mind as a possibility. School placement offices are also options. We do have a career placement facility at Collin College, but I'll be honest with you, they don't specialize in legal placements. I would say I'm more of a job placement agency probably than they are for paralegal positions. I'm going to list most of the jobs I hear about through LinkedIn. Sometimes employers want candidates with very specialized skill, and so I might approach candidates individually. And so if you get an email from me saying, hey, you told me that you have X experience and I've had an employer who is looking for that, I may reach out to you individually. And then, of course, we have our LinkedIn group. Application process. You want to prepare your documents. You want to have a resume ready. Now, we'll be talking more about this in a separate module, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. A couple of things to keep in mind, though, is that my philosophy is every resume ought to be customized for the job that you're looking or you're applying for. And certainly every cover letter needs to be customized. That goes without saying. But both of these can be customized. In this day of word processing, there's no need to have just a standard resume that you're not changing. You'll also want to have a list of professional references if you can at all have those. They don't necessarily go on the resume. In fact, I would say don't put them on your resume, but have them available. Then you'll want to work on your professional portfolio. These can go on your LinkedIn account, or you can bring them to interviews. These are going to be things like documents you prepare in the paralegal program that you can show to potential employers saying, hey, look, I already know how to do this. Look, here's an example of my work. And then you can use your LinkedIn profile. Once you get to a certain point in your career, you'll find that search agencies and employers will look for you, and you may well get inquiries saying, hey, we want somebody like you. So just having a LinkedIn profile can be a kind of a passive job search tool. Really, really important that you proofread your resume and your cover letter and your LinkedIn account really carefully. You can be the ideal candidate, but if there are significant errors in those documents, there are lots of employers in the legal business who will not consider you. That can be a deal breaker. So be sure you proof carefully. And we'll talk more about this when we get to that module. Avoid personal information if you're somebody who's more mature in my age category. Once upon a time, it was kind of considered the thing to do to add things to your resume that kind of gave a personal view of who you are, maybe your hobbies or things like that. The idea was it kind of humanized you. Nowadays, that's very passé. And if you put that information on it, you will be probably communicating to the employer that you are a very mature age and haven't updated your resume to reflect the current reality. So I definitely discourage you from doing that, and definitely discourage you from listing marital status. Whatever that might be. If you are going to give out reference names, be sure to contact these references beforehand. And that's one of the reasons I recommend you don't put on your resume, because you're going to be using this resume lots and lots of times. And my recommendation would be only to give references when the employer asks for it. And then when you give them, contact your references and remind them, hey, you've agreed to be my reference. Thank you so much. I just gave out your contact information to ABC company, so you may be getting a call or an email from them. That way the reference can be refreshed about you and be expecting that call and won't think, oh, this is just a solicitor or something, and not respond to it. The interview. Okay, some things to think about here. Again, we'll talk more about this later on. Is you'll want to research the employer thoroughly. You'll want to use martindale.com. You'll want to use the texasbar.com site. You'll want to Google the law firm, find information. You'll want to visit the law firm's website. Most will, even if they're very small. If they specialize in a particular area of the law, especially one if you don't know much about, you'll want to also find out about that. Be up to speed with the lingo of that particular discipline. You'll want to prepare answers to likely questions. Now look at your resume and see what, if you were the interviewer, what would you be asking? And have those answers ready-made. If there's difficult parts of your resume or difficult things, there's maybe gaps in your employment or you don't have as much experience as the job is requesting, then you'll want to have answers ready for that, but also ways of moving the conversation to the next topic. Everybody has some less than awesome things in their work and life experience. That goes with the territory, but being able to handle those questions and moving on to the positive things is a skill to work through. The other thing is listen closely to the interviewer. What is he or she interested in? What are the things that seem to be on his or her mind? And make sure that your answers are really answering the question. Sometimes you'll see, when I was at JCPenney, I was trained how to handle television interviews when issues would come up. And one of the things that, if you ever have media training, that you'll learn is that you really don't answer the question that the interviewer gave you. You answer the question you wish that the interviewer had given you. And that works in the media situation because they're looking for just a sound bite, but it doesn't work in the interview. You really need to answer the question. Dodging the unfortunate question, even if the interviewer doesn't follow up, probably means they've picked up on that and they've decided, oops, okay, this person is not someone we want. Go ahead and answer the question. Answer it honestly and completely, but also in a way that's advantageous for you, and then move on to the next topic. Okay, some questions that employers can ask are illegal or inappropriate. The textbook will say you shouldn't answer them, you should get outraged and stamp on out. And that is an approach, and certainly depending upon the question, that may be exactly what you want to do. I don't recommend it though, not in most cases. Even if you hear the question and decide, I never want to work for these people, you don't want to burn bridges in the legal community, because if you act rudely, that attorney that is a jerk may be best friends with a really awesome attorney who isn't a jerk. And that attorney may bandy your name around, and the other attorney may say, oh, I'm never going to interview that person because of what I've heard, even though it may not at all be true. So my suggestion, if you get illegal questions, is to graciously dodge them if that's the way you want to handle it, or depending upon your preferences, to answer the question. I wouldn't lie about the answer to the question, but you can consider answering it. They may be thinking, why should I answer an illegal or inappropriate question? Few reasons. First of all, the person who's interviewing you may not be a big part of your career in that particular place. For example, if you're working for a large corporation, the person interviewing you, you may never see again. I can remember times that I've interviewed in big corporations, and the people that I interviewed may have had a role in making the decision, but they weren't a factor in my day-to-day work life. And so the fact that they were a jerk really wasn't going to affect my experiences working in the place. Another thing is that sometimes questions that are inappropriate are asked not to offend. They're just, the person happens to be kind of ignorant relating to that particular subject. So you want to sometimes have a little bit of humanity, a little bit of sympathy for that particular person's circumstances. Not that it's excusable, but maybe you can be the person that helps that person learn how to handle that situation better. So I would not burn bridges. I would either graciously say, I'm not comfortable answering that question, but let me tell you about this, and transition to the next topic. Or I would answer in the hopes that you get a job, and then you get there and you see, well, yeah, this place is okay after all. Another really important thing to think about is having questions. And I recommend you have at least 5 questions when you go to the interview. That when you get asked the question at the end of the interview, what questions do you have for me? You will have some questions ready. I will tell you this again, not a story I'm particularly proud of, but when I would go to job interviews and I would get this question, I would always say, no, I don't have any questions, because I thought that was the right answer. I thought having questions meant that I hadn't been listening carefully, and that my saying I don't have questions meant that the interviewer was so complete. I was giving them a compliment. I was saying, you did a great job. I don't have any questions. But by saying I had questions, it meant either I wasn't paying attention or that person hadn't done a good job. Absolutely untrue. I was completely backwards on that one. You need to have questions. Employers want you to ask questions. That communicates you are engaged and that you are smart and thinking through the things you need to think through. So have questions. You aren't going to want to ask 5 questions. That's probably too many. But you'll want to ask 1 or 2 or possibly 3. So why do you need 5? Well, one of the reasons you need 5 is that that person whom you have been interviewing with has probably answered some of those questions. Gosh darn it. When I finally figured out I needed to have questions to go into job interviews, I would get so frustrated because I'd have these brilliant questions and then that interviewer would answer some of them, which meant I could no longer ask that question because then it appeared I wasn't paying attention, right? So you want to have several questions that you can have, that you can ask to protect yourself against that interviewer who's very, very thorough. So these questions ought to point out your research. So you want the questions to show, look what a wonderful researcher I am. You also want questions that show that you're very engaged and knowledgeable about the industry. These aren't genuine questions, I got to tell you. They are as part of the interview. So you don't want to ask questions like, how many weeks of vacation do I get? Or will I get an office with a door? Those questions you absolutely are interested in knowing the answer to, but they don't impress. These questions that you ask ought to be designed to impress. I like to have my questions in my head and then just ask them. But I also like to have a backup plan because sometimes it's kind of like, you know, deer in the headlights. You get addled, you get nervous, and you forget what you wanted to ask. And so if you refer to your list, that is perfectly fine. I actually am kind of impressed when an interviewee will at some point in the interview pull out her notebook or his notebook and say, I've got some questions, and look at the questions, or perhaps jot down something I said. You can do that too much because that does create some social distance between you and the interviewer. But especially if you can't think of the questions, it's much better to pull out your notebook, show that you came prepared for the interview, and ask the questions that you have. And if worst case scenario, if you can't think of any questions and the questions you prepared that interviewer had the gall to answer, you can at least pull out your question and say, oh, you did such a great job answering my first question. I was going to ask about this, but you answered it. Oh, you answered my second question. That is not the best scenario, but at least shows I came with questions and you answered them and I recognize you answered them. Second thing, prepare notes immediately afterwards. I wouldn't even leave the parking lot of the business where I'm interviewing and write down things that are going to prepare you for the next interview. You may interview the same folks, or you may interview with different folks, but you want to talk about some of the things that happened in that first interview. Something like, oh, it was so great talking with you last time. I really appreciated that story that you told me about the client who testified in a certain way, or something along those lines. It's a little ego stroking. It shows that you are paying attention. It shows that your story was the interviewer's story is engaging. Every interviewer likes to hear that stuff. If you interview with different people, you can still do it by saying, oh, it was so lovely meeting Bob Smith the last time I was here. He shared with me so much information about X. That's still appreciated. Even though it's a different interviewer, the interviewer will notice that you were paying attention, that you were getting names right, and you were doing those skills, and so that can be very impressive. So those are some things to think about as you go into that interview. Follow-up. Always send a thank you letter. I have interviewed lots of paralegals and lots of attorneys, and I find that most attorneys will send a thank you letter, and probably about a third of paralegal candidates will send a thank you letter or an email of some type. By no means all attorneys, but I'd say 60 to 70% of attorneys. It is so important to do that. It's not going to get you a job that you couldn't have gotten otherwise, and it's probably not going to disqualify you from a job. But if you are sitting on the bubble, it absolutely can make the difference. And it can also impress. So if you get the job, you come into that place of employment with people thinking very highly of your professional skills. I recommend that you email your thank you letter instead of writing a thank you letter and sending it through snail mail. People can differ on this one. Reasonable people can. I recommend an email from my experience at JCPenney. At JCPenney, when we interviewed someone, we were supposed to respond and tell what we thought about that person by the end of the day. And so a letter that we might receive 3 or 4 days later was pretty much of a waste of time. Unless we invited them to a second interview, then maybe we had, okay, they sent us that nice letter, so maybe that helps them actually get the job. They didn't help them get the second interview because it was too late by the time we got it, but it might help them get the job finally. Emails, I would recommend sending them from, from a laptop that you might take to pull out of your car, or from a smartphone or something like that. But you have to make sure there are no typos. You have to be so careful in an email or a thank you letter. It has to be perfect. You don't want that email to be what sinks you in the job. So that can be a really good way of doing it. And be sure that when you send the thank you note, send it to everyone that you interviewed with, that you really met with, and not the receptionist or folks that just kind of helped you get from one place to another. And also try to, for each person, include something personal. Thank you so much for telling me about the company benefits, something that actually happened. That personal touch is so important. Then maintaining a filing system. People say that looking for a job is really a full-time job in and of itself. The pay, though, and the benefits are lousy. But if you approach it from that standpoint, have a filing system, have things organized. Reach out to employers with whom you've interviewed or submitted a resume and touch base with them to see where they are in that process. Salary negotiations. We have tools at Collin that will help you find out what paralegals in our market are currently earning at various experience levels. That is a very good idea. But also consider benefits. An employer that gives you less pay but greater benefits can be a very good choice. Many employers will request some kind of salary range. You can decline to give it, or they may ask what you're currently in. You can decline to get it, certainly. That's well within your rights. Just keep in mind that very often that will mean that you're not going to be considered for that particular position. I wish you weren't required to make those choices, but unfortunately, for some employers, it is the way things happen. And it doesn't mean that the legal department is applauding that, or that the people who are requiring that you do that, you're even going to interact with in your position. So I wouldn't. It's fine if you don't want to participate, but I wouldn't think to yourself, oh, this is an evil company asking me to do this, so I don't want to work for them. I mean, you can make that judgment, but it doesn't necessarily follow the people you work with or the people that have created that policy. So I've covered the things that I wanted to cover. I'll leave these slides up just so you can jot down the blanks. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in class very soon. If you have questions, bring them to class and I'll be delighted to cover those. Thanks for your attention. Have a wonderful day.